Yeah, just the first question that we'd like to have with you. What are some of the key priorities that your organization is looking at in terms of unlocking climate change finance for the African continent?
So this event has aimed at exploring ways to help African countries unlock more climate finance. We have been having a very insightful discussion with high panelists, as you know, who participated. And I think from the discussion, we can really take a number of key takeaways. One key takeaway is, first of all, we really need to have strong governance framework to be able to maximize chances for mobilizing resources for climate action. It is extremely important. Another critical takeaway also is we need to be innovative. We need to have innovative approaches for finding resources for climate action. When I talked about innovation, we have in mind, for instance, some innovative instrument like having the possibility of issuing low-cost green bonds, the possibility of expanding the use of debt for climate swaps, the possibility also of putting in place carbon markets. All of those are innovative way for African countries to raise more resources for climate action. Some countries are doing it, but not enough across the continent. So I think we need to do that. Another important key takeaway is how we can also forge the right strategic partnership between actors that are involved in fighting climate change. When we talk about climate change and the fight against it, it's not only government that needs to be involved, it's also all of the domestic and external stakeholders. Whether we are talking about the private sector, whether we are talking about civil society organization, all of them need to play their fair role in making sure that we do have the right solution and we are successful in addressing climate change. So that's critical to have those strategic partnerships between those actors to be able to see to what extent the government can, for instance, actually put in place the right policies for the private sector to strive and to be able to be willing to participate in the effort to mobilize more resources. So that's important. One last thing that I would say also is when we talk about climate change, we are not talking only about an African problem. We are talking about a global problem. It means if African countries are fighting against climate change, they're doing it for their own benefit, of course, but they're also doing it for the benefit of the international community, which means that we need to make sure that when African countries raise money to be able to fight climate change, they don't do it solely on the basis of debt. It would be very unfair that African countries borrow at very high rates to be able to fight climate change. That would not be right. So I think it is important that we make sure that the global financial architecture is functioning enough to allow international institutions or like multilateral development banks, whether we are talking about the World Bank or the African Development Bank, to really have adequate resources for African countries to borrow. Why? Because I think multilateral institutions are known to have resources that are very much accessible at concessional rates or at low rates. So it is important that they have resources that are needed to support the countries. And when they support countries, yes, they do support government, but they can also support the private sector, right? Because when they put in place risk mitigation tool, the private sector is able to invest more in green infrastructure and other infrastructure or other actually investment that are likely to support climate action.
Thank you very much for that. Now, just to dive deep into something that you mentioned in your opening remarks about creating innovative solutions and mechanisms for raising finance for climate change. So how is the organization partnering with, say, banks, governments to come up with, such solutions that, African countries and private sector can, jump into for raising finance for climate change?
Thank you very much. I think you give me a good opportunity to present what Africatalyst is doing. What we do essentially is to conduct research on critical economic issues and finance issues. We do advisory. So based on the research and the evidence that we compile, we make some advisory, we provide advisory services to stakeholders, whether we are talking about governments or private sector. And another thing we do is when an issue is critical, based on the research that we did and the evidence that we compile, we also do advocacy when needed. For instance, on climate change,
Sure.
this is critical. So we are very much advocate at Africatalyst of how Africa and the international community should really go about it based on the research that we did. And it's a good opportunity to say that during this event today, we actually release a new report on how, for instance, we can have innovative approaches in the sense of upscaling the use of debt for climate and debt for nature swaps.
Sure.
Those are very much needed in Africa right now because many countries are facing, important debt vulnerabilities. As you know, many countries, more than half of Africa are either at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, which means that they really need to really be able to explore all of those innovative instruments that I talked about, like the swaps. And one last thing that also we do is, when needed, also we can be involved in capacity development efforts to help countries be able to really strengthen their policy framework and their governance framework. So all of that is what Africatalyst does. And I think the type of event also that we did today was also an opportunity to really
Sure.
bring more insightful ideas and innovative ideas to the table, so that I guess African officials and government officials, but also civil society actors and also the private sector and development actors in general are able to know what are the key issues that really the key solution to finding more funding for climate change. And I think this event today has really reached that purpose, and we are very proud of that.
Well, thank you very much. Just to our last question, and maybe before that, I mean, curiously, I think for our viewers would like to maybe just get a bit of an executive summary about the report that you mentioned that was released today at this event. So maybe if you just give us a scoop of that, what should we expect from that report?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think the objective of the report was to explore ways to really expand the use of debt for climate swaps. What it means is, as you have seen in the case of Gabon recently, they were able to buy back some of their the Euro bond,
Yes.
And be able to use some part of that deal for nature conservation purposes. So that's the type of thing that we are talking about. How you can find innovative approaches for reducing the stock of debt that you have and use that those economies that are actually being realized and allocate them to either climate actions or conservation purposes. So that's what actually Africatalyst has been doing. As you know, we have a pool of experts who really contribute to our analytical work, and that's what we rely on to be able to really think out of the box and be able to contribute to ideas that help actually find good solutions for fighting climate change and raising more finance for African countries to be able to implement their adaptation and mitigation policies.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, we're looking forward to getting our hands on that report and just sharing some of its content to our viewers. Now, just to our last question. I mean, there's always, a trade-off between national priorities and climate change priorities. So how do nations in the continent, in your opinion, the Africatalyst, be able to align some of those different priorities that are national, but also climate change priorities?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think what we have seen and what many African countries are saying is they very much need to really meet their commitment, those commitments that they made as part of the Paris Agreement, to be able to implement their adaptation and mitigation policies so that they can contribute to the reduction of emissions. And I think all countries are committed. But to do so, they should not do it at the expense of other development priorities. So when I talk about that, I'm thinking about whether it's education, whether it is health, whether it is infrastructure. How can we make sure that the country is really free space for fighting climate change, while of course being able also to satisfy the needs, other development needs, whether it is to build schools or hospitals, healthcare, roads, infrastructure. This is critical. You cannot expect countries to sort of use their scarce resources and just divert them entirely.
Adaptation,
Yes. So we need to make sure that we, the countries are afforded the opportunity to get enough resources to be able to fight climate change, but also at the same time meet their development objectives. And that's a critical question so that we need to respond. And I think, yes, first of all, Africa has to play a role because, as we know, to mobilize resources for climate change, a bulk of it has to come from domestic sources. So it is important that our countries are able to put in place the necessary policies that would allow to maximize the domestic source of revenues that would be allocated to climate change. That's certainly true. But at the same time, I think the international community has an obligation also to make sure that they support countries, particularly those with low income, to be able to raise more resources for climate finance. That's why we are saying that it is also up to the international community to really reform the global financial architecture so that they can allow multilateral
poor countries to actually afford.
Fully agree. So poor country can really access low-cost finance from multilateral institutions like the World Bank, but also regional institutions like African Development Bank. And I think it is the international community that needs to do that job. There is some thinking, some work, some discussion around reforming the global financial architecture, but maybe not ambitious enough at this stage to really reach that objective. So we really need to push, and I think that's the reason why this Africa Climate Summit is extremely critical for Africa to really let their opinions known.
Voice be heard,
and speak in one voice to make sure that they really define their own strategies for priorities for fighting climate change. But then, of course, the solution has to be global because not just, like I said, climate change is not an African problem, it's a global problem. Each part of the world has to come with its contribution to the solution. And I think from Nairobi, the summit this week, and Africa will be able to really share with the world actually its view about how Africa can support that and how the international community can support Africa to meet their climate but also development objectives.